Hi, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Minor Prophets. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. Welcome to this session of the Minor Prophets. We're starting the book of Nahum tonight, and we're doing all these in chronological order. So Nahum follows on from Micah. So we're going to look at just the intro down to chapter 3, verse 7. I've given you an outline there. We see that this book is broken up into three sections. We have the doom of destruction, first section. Second section, the description of Nineveh's doom. And the third section is the reason for Nineveh's doom. Now, in the introduction section here, we see the burden of Nineveh, the book of the vision of Nahum the Elkoshite. This is chapter 1, verse 1. The name Nahum in Hebrew means full of comfort or comforter or consolation. It comes from the same root as the name Noah, which means to rest or to comfort. As far as his family is concerned, we know nothing about him. He doesn't give us his father's name or his grandfather's name or anything of that nature. In regard to the date of writing, he doesn't state whose reign he's prophesying under, but at the time he's writing, Nineveh is at full strength. Nineveh was destroyed in 612 BC, so obviously this book would have been written prior to 612 BC. And then in chapter 3, verse 18, he mentions, chapter 3, verse 8, he mentions Nineveh's destruction of the Egyptian city Nahum, and that's Thebes, and that happened in the year 665 or 664 BC. And as I said, that city Nahum is better known as Thebes, and the emperor who destroyed it was known as Assurbanipal. You'll have to excuse my pronunciations of some of these names tonight. Thebes was then regained by the Egyptians 10 years later in 654 BC. So based upon what he says within the book, the date of his book was somewhere between 663 and 654 BC, which would put it during the reign of Manasseh in Judah. Now, where is this village located? Nahum says he was an Elkoshite, meaning he was from the village of Elkosh, but up until now, no such place has been discovered by archaeologists in the land of Israel. Some have suggested that this is a town as Elkosh in Assyria, but it's not likely that Nahum lived in Assyria. Another suggestion is that he came from the city of Capernaum, because the Hebrew name is Kfar Nahum, or the village of Nahum. So that's a good suggestion. However, there is nothing by way of historical geography to connect Capernaum with the word Elkosh. By itself, Nahum was a very common name in biblical times. So there's no need to assume that Capernaum was named after this prophet. The strongest possibility is that there is a small village in Judah called El-Kisi in the Shephelah, which is the same region from which Micah came. And that's the closest thing we can find that compares with the name Elkosh. So it could well have been that Nahum came from that place, but two of these suppositions are only guesswork. What we do know is that he was from Judah, and he never mentions the northern kingdom. By this time, Israel, the northern kingdom, had already gone into captivity, into Assyrian captivity. That happened back in 722 BC. So this means that he prophesied within the land of Judah, and we see that in chapter 1, verse 15. What's the historical setting that he's dealing with here? Well, the city of Nineveh was founded by Nimrod, and we see this back in Genesis chapter 10, verses 8 to 12. So the first time Nineveh, which is the capital of Assyria, made contact with Judah, the southern kingdom, was under the emperor known as Shalmaneser III. Shalmaneser III helped to destroy Israel, and he devastated Judah. Then Sennacherib became the emperor of Assyria. Now he's the one who actually made Nineveh its capital. And Sennacherib built it up into a complex of 4 cities. So he actually had 4 cities under one administration. Now these 4 cities had 2 walls. There was the inner wall that surrounded Nineveh proper, and that was 6.2 miles around the wall. And then the outer wall, which took in the other 3 cities, was 54 miles around. So it's a pretty big area. A little bit of perspective here. The present old city of Jerusalem, the walled city, is only 2.5 miles around. So the inner wall of Nineveh was quite a bit bigger at 6.2 miles. I'm talking miles because this is just the way the commentaries and stuff deal. They don't deal in kilometers. Yet the outer wall was 54 miles around. So 54 miles is around about 90 kilometers. Now, within the outer wall was a total of 175 square miles. And it was a well-fortified wall, the city. The base of the wall was 50 feet thick, which is, I don't know, it's around about 14 meters, 16 meters, something like that. And it was 100 feet high, about 32 meters. The top of the wall was 12 feet wide, around about almost 4 meters, or a little bit less than 4 meters. And they bragged that 3 chariots could ride abreast on top of Nineveh's wall. It was so wide. Now, on top of that wall was fortified by 150 defensive towers, which were individually 200 feet high, or around about 60 meters high. He built a royal palace in Nineveh, which had a great hall that was 40 feet by 50 feet. So that would be 12 meters by about, I don't know, 50 or 20, no, more, at 40 meters. 12 meters by 40 meters, something like that. Now, he built up an armory in his city, and it took him 6 years to stock that armory with weapons. Now, the main street which cut through the center of Nineveh, probably the street that the prophet Jonah walked through, was 75 feet wide. So that's about, I don't know, 24 meters wide, something like that. This is just a picture here of the restored gate at the site of the ancient city of Nineveh in Assyria. That's the restored gate. It's huge. It's a huge gate. Now, although it seemed impregnable, eventually the city was destroyed in 612 BC by a combination of 2 armies. We had the Babylonian army under King Nabopolassar, and the king of the Medes, the Median army under Xerxes. I think that's how you say it. Nineveh actually fell in 2 stages. First stage was the battle for the outer wall, and it involved 3 battles fought between the months of May and August. In all 3 battles, the attackers were actually defeated. The Ninevites decided that they could relax their security, and they threw a big party. And while the Ninevites were all carousing, then the invaders were able to get through the outer wall, and then they laid siege to the inner wall. The first stage is mentioned by Micah in Micah 1:10 and Micah 2:4 and 15 and Micah 3:11. Second stage was fought over a 2-year period between 614 and 612 BC. It was the battle for the inner wall. And what finally defeated the inner wall was some heavy, unexpected rains in the months of July and August of 612 BC. Normally, rain doesn't fall there at that time of the year. And what happened was it caused the Tigris River to flood, and it destroyed 2 miles of that inner wall, giving the attackers easy access to the city, and the city was captured. The second stage we see in Nahum chapters 1, verse 8, chapter 2, verse 6, and verse 8, and chapter 3, 13. Major points of the book of Nahum, well, we have 4. First up, God rules in the kingdom of men. God is sovereign. Secondly, God is a God of vengeance, especially on behalf of Israel. And third, the outworking of the Abrahamic covenant, especially that principle of Genesis 12, verse 3, which says, I will curse them that curse thee. Nineveh cursed Judah. Now God will curse Nineveh. God, the fourth major point is that God is a stronghold in time of trouble. The theme of the book, it's the doom of Nineveh. Nahum preaches the message and gives the prophecy Jonah would have preferred to give. If you remember back in Jonah's day, he didn't want to go there. This book is concerned entirely with a nation outside the Jewish kingdom. It deals only with the Assyrian Empire, and it is especially in reference to Assyria's capital, Nineveh. And the prophecy concerns Nineveh as a city. Now, Nahum is going to point out in chapter 1, verse 15, the prophecy of the coming destruction of Nineveh will be a source of comfort to Judah. As Nahum develops his theme of the doom of Nineveh, he is essentially completing Jonah's prophecy. Although under Jonah, Nineveh repented, but by the time we come to the days of Nahum, which is more than a century later, Assyria and Nineveh had gone back to their evil ways, and this time there will be no repentance that will save the city. In the New Testament, the only possible quotation of Nahum, and this is not definite at all, but it is possible that Romans 10:15 is a reference back to Nahum 1:15. Now, the way the prophecy came to Nahum, he uses two different phrases. And we see this in chapter 1, verse 1. It's the burden of Nineveh. Hebrew word means it's a heavy burden. It's a heavy message. And the message he's about to give concerning Nineveh is a very heavy message. And the second thing here, he says, it is the book of the vision. So what does this mean? It means that it came to Nahum by a vision, meaning he could actually see what was going to happen. While a lot of prophets use the term vision, he's the only one to give it this whole title, the book of the vision. So he's the only prophet to use this formula. So we come now to the first section. The first section is the doom of destruction. And this goes from chapter 1, verse 2 to chapter 1, verse 15. We see the destroyer of Nineveh in chapter 1, verses 2 to 8. So we have three divisions. We have the doom, we have the destruction, and we have the reasons for the destruction of Nineveh. So here we have the doom. And if we go from verse 2, we'll just read verses 2 and part of verse 3. Jehovah is a jealous God and avengeth. Jehovah avengeth and is full of wrath. Jehovah taketh vengeance on his adversaries, and he reserveth wrath for his enemies. And then first part of verse 3, it says, Jehovah is slow to anger. As he describes the destroyer as Nineveh in Nahum 1, verses 2 to 8. He begins by describing God in verse 2 as the God of vengeance. And this is the basic theme that runs through all three chapters. And he will render vengeance against Nineveh. It is a vengeance on behalf of the people of Israel. When God issues his vengeance, it's not impulsive. Because in verse 3, he also points out God is the God of patience, and he makes a reference there back to Exodus 34, verses 6 to 7. God has been very patient with Nineveh. They were warned of God's vengeance by Jonah, and they realized God's patience because when they repented, he didn't destroy Nineveh in the days of Jonah. After that generation of Nineveh who had repented had passed away, the next one returned to their old ways. So Nineveh has now returned to her old ways. She's experienced the patience of God, but has now rejected it and so they will experience the vengeance of God. It says, the second part of verse 3 says, Jehovah is great in power and will by no means clear the guilty. Jehovah has his way in the whirlwind and in the storm, and the clouds are the dust of his feet. He rebuketh the sea and maketh it dry, and drieth up all the rivers. Bashan languisheth, and Carmel, and the flower of Lebanon languisheth. The mountains quake at him, and the hills melt, and the earth is upheaved at his presence. Yea, the world and all that dwell therein. So we see here that God can carry out his vengeance because in these verses 3 to 5, he is a God of power. And this is seen in 4 different ways. In verse 3, God controls the weather. He controls the whirlwind. He controls the storm. He controls the clouds. He controls the climate. In verse 4, he controls the water supply. He can cause even those places which are perennially supplied with water to become dry, because here he mentions Bashan, the Golan Heights. That's where you have the Banyas River, one of the key sources of the Jordan River flowing out. And that generally never dries up, but even God can make it to dry up. He mentions Carmel. Carmel is also well watered, and even in the days of Elijah, when that 3-year drought came while the whole land was dry, there was sufficient water in Carmel for the contest of Carmel between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Lebanon, where the other 3 sources of the Jordan River flow from, is also well watered. But these 3 places, Bashan, Carmel, and Lebanon, are all generally well watered, but God, who controls the water supply, can cause them all to become dry. And then in verse 5, we see that the mountains quake at him and the hills melt and the earth is upheaved at his presence. God is in control of the dry land. Second part of verse 5 here, we see that he is also in control of humanity. Yes, the world and all that dwell therein. So he's a God of power, and because he's a God of power, he can carry out the vengeance that he threatens. Verse 6 says, who can stand before his indignation, and who can abide in the fierceness of his anger? His wrath is poured out like fire, and the rocks are broken asunder by him. So in verse 6, we see that he is also a God of wrath, and his wrath forces him to render judgment against sin. Verse 7, Jehovah is good. He's a stronghold in the day of trouble, and he knoweth them that take refuge in him. So in verse 7, we see that God is a God of refuge. And in the midst of wrath, this God is a rock of refuge, but the refuge is limited to those who seek refuge in him. And in verse 8, but with an overrunning flood, he will make a full end of her place and will pursue his enemies into darkness. Remember, this is a burden against Nineveh. So he's talking about Nineveh here. In verse 8, he is the God who will destroy Nineveh. He mentions here with an overrunning flood. Now, whenever the figure of a flood is used symbolically, it is always a symbol of a military invasion. And indeed, Nineveh will be destroyed by a military invasion by the armies of Media and the armies of Babylon. Verse 8, it might not be symbolic, it might be literal, because God did actually use the flooding of the Tigris River to destroy 2 miles of the inner wall, by which the enemy were able to get in to the city. So it could actually be the literal flooding as well. If he means it literally, it refers to that flood that wiped out the 2 miles of the inner wall. If he means it symbolically, it is going to be done by a military invasion. The reason it's hard to know which one is because both turned out to be true. It says his enemies will be pursued into darkness. So Nineveh, after being destroyed, will disappear to an extent that 3 centuries later, when Alexander, the Greek commander, Alexander the Great, when he encamped by this mound, he didn't even realize he was encamped at the ruins of Nineveh. In fact, Nineveh so disappeared that it was not rediscovered until 1845 by an archaeologist named Layard. That's how it's just disappeared. So here in verses 2 to 8 of chapter 1, he describes the kind of God that he is, who's going to destroy Nineveh. He is all these things. He is the God of vengeance, but he's the God of patience. He's the God of power. He's the God of wrath, and he's the God of refuge. And when God is looked upon in his attributes, all these things will be looked upon together. As soon as one emphasizes one over against the other, we now begin to have a faulty theology. So people have a very hard time of believing that God can send people to hell because he's a God of love. But they're emphasizing one attribute and ignoring some others that he has. And God must be known by all his attributes. Now we see the destruction of Nineveh in chapter 1, verses 9 to 14. So the second part of the passage, verses 9 to 14, after talking about who the destroyer of Nineveh is, he now deals with the destruction of Nineveh. What do you devise against Jehovah? Verse 9. He will make a full end. Affliction shall not rise up the second time. In verses 9 to 11, God now addresses Nineveh directly. In verse 9, he exposes Nineveh's devices, Nineveh's conspiracies. All of Nineveh's evils have been against God, and because of that sin, Nineveh is destined to be turned into a full end. Now, God promises concerning Nineveh, he says, affliction shall not rise up the second time. Assyria brought an end to the kingdom of Israel. They brought the northern kingdom to an end in history. That was in 722 BC. But they'll not succeed in bringing the kingdom of Judah to an end. That's the point of the promise here. Affliction shall not rise up a second time. It rose up the first time against Israel, but it will not rise up the second time. Furthermore, Nineveh herself will not rise again. Babylon was destroyed and rebuilt, but Nineveh, once destroyed, will not be rebuilt. In verse 10, for entangled like thorns and drunken as with their drink, they are consumed utterly as dry stubble. Verse 11, there is one gone forth out of thee that deviseth evil against Jehovah, that counseleth wickedness. So in verse 10, Nineveh is destined for destruction. And just like thorns and stubbles are easily burned, so will Nineveh be. And although they get drunk, and out of drunkenness they arrive at some false hope, they'll be surprised during their revelry. Remember, outer wall was taken while they were having a big party celebrating they'd repelled these 3 attacks. And in verse 11, he focuses on one king who historically is known as Sennacherib. The one who has gone forth is Sennacherib, whose purpose is evil against Jehovah. He said he's consulted with wickedness. Now, the Hebrew word for wickedness is the word Belial, which is an Old Testament name for Satan. So what he does here is, excuse me, he pictures Sennacherib as Satan's messenger. Now, the details of what Sennacherib does to Judah is spelled out in Isaiah chapters 36 and 37. Now, having addressed Nineveh, he points out she is destined for total destruction and her king will be punished. And then in verses 12 to 13, he now addresses Judah. Thus says Jehovah, though they be in full strength, and likewise many, even so shall they be cut down, and he shall pass away. Though I have afflicted thee, I will afflict thee no more. And now will I break his yoke from off thee, and I'll burst thy bonds in sunder. So here in verse 12, God is speaking to Jehovah, speaking to Judah. He tells them that Judah will be, that Assyria will be destroyed. Need a drink. He says, though they are in full strength, means in full armor, though they are many, he pictures Nineveh numerous and fully armed, yet they will be cut down, they will be destroyed. He shall pass away. The he that shall pass away is Sennacherib, the king. The king and all will pass away. Now, although if you cast your mind back, we know that God did use Assyria to afflict Judah, and he did it under Sennacherib. In actual fact, in Isaiah chapter 10, verse 5, he says, Ho, Assyria, the rod of mine anger, the staff in whose hand is mine indignation. So God used Assyria to afflict both Israel and Judah previously. I'll afflict you no more, well, not by Assyria. Judah's freedom from Assyria is imminent. And in verse 13, and now will I break the yoke off from you. I will burst your bonds in sunder. So God will now turn upon Assyria and punish her, and the one who afflicted Israel and Judah will now be afflicted herself. Remember Genesis 12:3, I will bless those who bless you, I'll curse those who curse you. And verse 14, and Jehovah has given commandment concerning thee, that no more of thy name be sown. Out of the house of thy gods will I cut off the graven image and the molten image. I will make thy grave, for thou art vile. So in verse 14, he also addresses Assyria again, and he points out the Assyrian kingdom is destined to come to an end. It says in verse 14, no more shall thy name be sown. Now, the Assyrian emperors were especially concerned that their name and memory be perpetuated. But God is not going to allow that to happen. Not only will the Assyrian monarchs no longer be perpetuated, but in verse 14, there'll be a total destruction of the gods of Assyria. Something Isaiah also predicted in Isaiah 36, 18 to 20, and Isaiah 37, 10 to 13. Verse 14 ends with the fall of Assyria. I will make thy grave permanent. It will not be temporary, it will be permanent. And the reason is because you are vile. So in verse 13, Judah is to be freed from the Assyrian yoke. And then in verse 14, Assyria is to be totally destroyed and buried. Now we come to the comfort of Judah in verse 15, chapter 1, verse 15. Behold, upon the mountains the feet of him that bringeth good tidings, that publisheth peace. Keep thy feasts, O Judah, perform thy vows, for the wicked one shall no more pass through thee, he is utterly cut off. So in verse 15 here, that's what is going to provide comfort to Judah. Verse 15 is a quotation of Isaiah 52:7. And like the New Testament does with the Old, he is simply quoting it as an application with a different view in mind here. In Isaiah's context, in Isaiah 52:7, that's speaking of the comfort of the Messiah. But Nahum takes that quote from Isaiah and he gives it a different application. And he's dealing with the comfort that Judah will feel as a result of Nineveh's fall. So the New Testament does with the Old what one prophet in the Old does with another prophet in the Old. Uses it as a different application. Now in verse 15, Judah's response will be to keep the feast, especially those pilgrimage feasts of Passover, Pentecost, or weeks, and tabernacles. They're the three feasts that all Jewish men must attend. Judah's response will be to keep the vows. And these are probably the vows that they made to God in their time of peril. For the wicked one shall no more pass through thee. He is utterly cut off. The reason being is that Assyria will no longer pass through, and Assyria can no longer come and interrupt the observance of these festivals. Again, he uses the word Belial when he talks about the wicked one passing through no more. And the point here is that the messenger of Satan, Sennacherib, will no longer pass through the land anymore. Her destruction will be that total. Now we see in the second section of Nahum's book, the description of Nineveh's doom, and we find this in chapter 2, verses 1 to 13. We see the description of the invasion in verses 1 to 7 of chapter 2. Verse 1, he that dasheth in pieces is come up against thee. Keep the fortress, watch the way. Make thy loins strong, fortify thy power mightily. For Jehovah restoreth the excellency of Jacob as the excellency of Israel. For the emptiers have emptied them out and destroyed their vine branches. Okay, now, in verses 1 to 7, he describes the invasion itself, with verse 1 describing the approach of the invaders. And these are the ones who are coming to dash them in pieces. The ones coming against them, against Nineveh, are Nabopolassar, the Babylonian, who with Xerxes, the Mede, and they are also joined now by Scythians as well. So in verse 1, there's a call to man the defenses, but it won't do them any good. These are the Ninevites, man the defenses, because in verse 2, the approach of the invading armies marks God's vengeance on behalf of Israel. Israel's excellency is now to be restored. She'll be free of the Assyrian yoke. Assyria was the emptier of Israel. Now Assyria will be emptied herself. And verse 3 describes the armor of the invaders. The shields are colored red. The soldiers are dressed in scarlet. The chariots are made of fiery iron. The spears of hard cypress wood. So they are very well armed and prepared for war. Their dressing in red shows they have had battle experience. And in verse 4, this is chapter 2, verse 4, the chariots rage in the streets. They rush to and fro in the broad ways. The appearance of them is like torches. They run like the lightnings. In verse 4, he describes the battle for the suburbs until the fighting in the outer streets is finally won and victory is achieved with speed. In verse 5, he remembereth his nobles. They stumble in their march. They make haste to the wall thereof, and the mantelet is prepared. So in verse 5, they finally arrive at the wall. Their arrival at the city wall so quickly marks Nineveh's doom. In fact, they arrive at the city wall so quickly, they were stumbling over each other. This mantelet, it's a siege engine that is now laid against the wall. In verse 6, the gates of the rivers are opened and the palace is dissolved. So here in verse 6, he predicts the city's destruction will come by water. The gates of the river are opened. Nineveh was built on the north side of the east bank of the Tigris, and what they did was they built a canal that went through the street called the Kosher, K-H-S-R. I don't know how you'd say it. It was a canal that diverted water from the Tigris, and it ran through the center of the city of Nineveh. But now the river floods. And historically, When the river flooded, it destroyed 2 miles of the wall and a breach was made. Now, also in verse 6, we see that the palace is dissolved. Now, it's when the river destroyed 2 miles of wall that caused the Ninevites, the Assyrians, to lose heart, because there was an old Assyrian prophecy that said, when the river becomes Nineveh's enemy, the city will be destroyed. This was a very ancient oracle in Nineveh. And so when the river flooded in the middle of summer, because that's when it happens here, in the middle of summer, when they don't even have rain, but they did then, it destroyed 2 miles of wall, and that caused the king to become so depressed, and the inhabitants became depressed because of this ancient oracle. In fact, the king was so depressed, he had a large funeral pyre built. And what he did was, he brought all his concubines to the funeral pyre, and he burned himself and his concubines to death. That's how they viewed the fulfillment of the prophecy. When the river becomes the enemy of Nineveh, the city will be destroyed. And this emperor's name was Sardanapalus, something like that. Now, while the emperor and his concubines were burned, in verse 7, the queen is captured. And it is decreed, she's uncovered, she's carried away. And her handmaids moan as with the voice of doves, beating upon their breasts. Now, Huzab in Hebrew is uncovered, and that refers to the queen, her name, Huzab. It was also the Hebrew name for Ishtar. So the queen of Nineveh was to be the representative of the goddess Ishtar, and now he pictures her as being stripped, which is a sign of a conquered queen, and she goes on to captivity while her handmaids go into mourning. Now we see the destruction, or the description of the destruction in verses 8 to 13. But Nineveh has been from of old like a pool of water, yet they flee away. Stand, stand, they cry, but none looketh back. Take ye the spoil of silver, take the spoil of gold, for there's no end of the store, the glory of all goodly furniture. Now, in these verses, he gives a description of the destruction itself, beginning in verse 8, describing the flight of Nineveh's soldiers. Whereas at the height of her history, the soldiers of Nineveh were characterized by attacking and winning. Now in her fall, they'll be characterized by cowardice as they flee away. They're running. Even when their commanders cry to them, stand, stand, they run away so fast they don't even look back to see if anything is happening in their favor. When the soldiers flee, the city becomes easy prey. And then in verse 9, it describes the taking of the spoil and all the wealth Nineveh had amassed from her previous wars and conquests. Now she's being spoiled herself. Verse 10 describes the sacking of the city. She's empty and void and waste, and the heart melteth, and the knees smite together, and anguish is in all loins, and the faces of them all are waxed pale. Empty, void, and waste are used. The Hebrew is actually an alliteration here, and all three words sound very similar. And trying to represent these words in English, it would be something like sack, sacking, and ransacking, or destruction, devastation, and dilapidation, dissolved, desolated, and drained. Just plain words. So that will bring out what is happening in the Hebrew text of verse 10, which is using alliteration here. Now, in the end, all the inhabitants who were once characterized by pride over conquests are now characterized by fear. Where is it? This is verse 11. Where is the den of lions and the feeding place of the young lions, where the lion and the lioness walked? The lions whelped, and none made them afraid. The lion did tear in pieces enough for his whelps, and strangled for his lionesses, and filled his caves with prey and his dens with rapine. Behold, I'm against thee, says Jehovah of hosts, and I will burn her chariots in the smoke, and the sword shall devour thy young lions, and I'll cut off thy prey from the earth, and the voice of thy messengers shall no more be heard. So in verses 11 to 13, picturing Nineveh like a former great lion, his point here is that the lion of Assyria is now fallen over. In Assyrian history, they did use the lion as their symbol, as did the Babylonians. In verse 11, that lion is to be no more. In verse 12, once the lion was characterized as one that does the destroying, but now in verse 13, God will destroy the lion. And then we see the reasons for Nineveh's doom in chapter 3, verses 1 to 19. We'll see the history of blood in chapter 3, verses 1 to 3. Here is the reason for Nineveh's doom. In chapter 3, we have the third main part of the book, and here he finally gives the reasons for Nineveh's doom and why God is so harsh with Nineveh. And we saw this in the first 2 chapters. In the outline, these 19 verses of chapter 3 are subdivided into 5 sections, and these essentially, the first 4 particularly, are the reasons for Nineveh's fall. The first reason is the historical fact of Nineveh's bloodletting and bloodshedding in verses 1 to 3. Woe to the bloody city! It is full of lies and rapine. The prey departeth not. The noise of the whip and the noise of the rattling of wheels and prancing horses and bounding chariots. So, now Nineveh is called the city of bloods. That's a better translation rather than the bloody city. In Hebrew, the word for blood is in the plural, and it literally reads the city of bloods. This means it was characterized by an enormous amount of bloodshed. It was also full of lies because Assyria deceived other nations. Vain promises of help and protection were made and not fulfilled. And one of those examples is King Ahaz of Judah. When he was attacked by Israel, the northern kingdom, he called upon the Assyrians to help him. They did help him by destroying Israel, but then they also subjugated Judah. So the cry is, woe to the bloody city. The punishment comes in verses 2 to 3 for this reason. Verse 2 describes the noise of the conflict and the overwhelming shedding of blood in this city now, as she once shed the blood of others elsewhere. We see the horsemen mounting and the flashing sword and the glittering spear and a multitude of slain. This is verse 3. And the great heap of corpses, and there is no end of the bodies. They stumble upon their bodies. So in verse 3, God reemphasizes Nineveh's guilt of much shedding of blood. So many corpses, so many bodies, that they must stumble over these. Just how bloody the city of Nineveh was has become well known because of archaeology, and we actually have Assyrian records themselves where the Assyrian monarchs describe in pride what they did to subjugated cities and people. I'll read you an account here of an Assyrian king named Ashur-nasir-pal III. He reigned between 885 and 860 BC, and he describes one of his campaigns, and we see this in the ancient records of Assyrian Babylonia by Luckenbill. He says, great numbers of them in the land of Kiri I slew. 260 of their fighting men I cut down with the sword. I cut off their heads and I formed them into pillars. Bubu, the son of Buba, I flayed in the city of Arbela, and I spread his skin upon the city wall. Now, flaying, it's a popular mode of execution by the Assyrians, whereby whilst a man was still alive, they found a way to totally skin his body, and then they would dry the skin out in the sun, in this case, upon the city wall. Goes on to say here, I flayed all the chief men in the city of Suru who had revolted, and I covered the pillar with their skins. Some I walled up within the pillar. Some I impaled upon the pillar and stakes, and others I bound to stakes around about the pillar. Many within the border of my own land I flayed, and I spread their skins upon the walls, and I cut off the limbs of the officers, the royal officers who had rebelled. Ahiah Baba, I took to Nineveh, I flayed him, I spread his skin upon the wall of Nineveh. 3,000 of there, the people in the city of Telah, warriors I put to the sword. Many captives from among them I burned with fire. From some I cut off their hands and their fingers, and from others I cut off their noses, their ears, and their fingers. And many I put out the eyes. This is what the monarch, this is what the king is doing. I made one pillar of the living and another of heads, and I bound their heads to posts, tree trunks, around about the city. Their young men and maidens I burned in the fire, the city I destroyed. It just goes on and on. 800 of their people, the people in Petura, fighting men I put to the sword and cut off their heads. Multitudes I captured alive, and the rest of them I burned with fire. I formed a pillar of the living and of heads over against his city gate, and 700 men I impaled in stakes. Their young men and their maidens I burned in the fire. So, this is a very typical of various Assyrian emperors, not just this one. Capturing a city, they would kill some, they would impale, which means what they did was they stuck a stake right into your abdomen and they lifted you up alive on it. And others they flayed. They also built walls and they plastered people alive inside a wall and just let them slowly starve to death. Mass murder, and that's why it is known in verse 1 as the city of blood. And because of its history of blood of this nature, that is one reason why Nineveh is going to suffer the destruction of chapters 1 and 2. The atrocious practice of cutting off hands and feet, ears and nose, gouging out eyes, lopping off heads, and then binding them to vines or heaping them up before city gates. The utter fiendishness of which captives could be impaled or flayed alive through a process of which the skin was gradually and completely removed. This planned frightfulness, systematically enforced by the bloody city, was now to be avenged. We see Nineveh's involvement with the occult. Verse 4, because of the multitude of the whoredoms of the well-favored harlot, the mistress of witchcrafts, that selleth nations through her whoredoms, and families through her witchcrafts. So a second reason for Nineveh's destruction is because of her involvement with the occult world. Verse 4 specified this in itself. She was guilty of a multitude of religious prostitution, a multitude of witchcraft, heavy in the practice of the black arts. In fact, Nineveh, he says at that time, was a leader in religious prostitution and occult practices. He says she is guilty of getting others to practice Assyrian occult practices, one of which we know from 2 Kings chapter 16, verses 10 to 19, was King Ahaz. Ahaz was one of those to be influenced by Assyrian occult practices who began practicing it himself. Verse 5, we read 5 to 7 here. Behold, I am against thee, says Jehovah of hosts, and I will uncover thy skirts upon thy face, and I will show the nations thy nakedness and the kingdoms thy shame. And I will cast abominable filth upon thee and make thee vile, and will set thee as a gazing stock. And it shall come to pass that all they that look upon thee shall flee from thee and say, Nineveh is laid waste. Who will bemoan her? Excuse me. When shall I seek comforters for thee? Because of the sin of the occult practices in verse 4, the punishment is now spelled out in verses 5 to 7. And in verse 5, Nineveh is to become naked, uncovered, naked. That's a sign of humiliation. In verse 6, she's to become a gazing stock, a further sign of humiliation. Finally, in verse 7, she'll be so humiliated by her coming destruction and sacking, there'll be none to comfort Nineveh, and none are going to feel sorry for Nineveh. Like other prophets have done what we see in verse 7, he plays here a word game with the meaning of his own name. Comforters in Hebrew is Menahem or Menahamin, and Menahem means comforter. So we have here a play upon upon words of Nahum's name in this section here, where he speaks about comforter. Remember, Nahum's name means comforter or comforting. Okay, that's it for this session. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.